Hey there, you're looking kind of cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out all my other socials. Enjoy. The sound of a key turning in the lock sent a jolt of panic through Mateo's body. He froze, eyeliner pencil hovering inches from his face, heart pounding in his chest. Who could be at the door? His roommate wasn't due back for hours. "Mateo, you home?" a familiar voice called out. It was Mrs. Rossi, his elderly neighbor from across the hall. "I brought over some of that lasagna you like." Mateo's eyes darted frantically around the bathroom, taking in the array of makeup products scattered across the counter. There was no time to hide everything. He scrambled to pull off the silky blouse he'd been wearing, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste. "Just a minute," he called out. Voice cracking, he yanked on a plain t-shirt, fumbling with the buttons. "I'll be right there." But it was too late. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Rossi's voice grew closer. "I hope you don't mind me using my spare key, dear. I knocked, but... Oh." She appeared in the bathroom doorway, a covered dish in her hands. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene before her. Mateo, flushed and disheveled, surrounded by an explosion of cosmetics. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Mateo felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room, his carefully guarded secret exposed in an instant. Mrs. Rossi broke the silence first. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to intrude." She set the lasagna down on the counter, careful not to disturb any of the makeup. "I should have waited for you to answer." Mateo couldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the floor, willing it to open up and swallow him whole. It's not what it looks like," he stammered, knowing how pathetic the lie sounded even as the words left his mouth. To his surprise, Mrs. Rossi's voice was gentle when she replied, "It's all right, dear. You don't need to explain anything to me." He risked a glance up and saw no judgment in her kind, weathered face, only concern and a hint of understanding. Mateo started, then stopped. The weight of his secret pressed down on him, suffocating, and suddenly he couldn't bear it anymore. The words tumbled out in a rush. "I like to dress up sometimes, as a woman. I have for years, but I've never told anyone. I was so afraid of what people would think." Mrs. Rossi nodded, taking in this information with a calm that surprised him. "And do you have a name? When you're dressed up, I mean?" The question caught Mateo off guard. He'd never spoken it aloud before, this name he'd chosen for his other self. "Adeline," he whispered. "I call myself Adeline." "Adeline," Mrs. Rossi repeated, smiling. "That's a beautiful name." Mateo felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He blinked them back, overwhelmed by the unexpected acceptance. Mrs. Rossi reached out, patting his arm gently. "You know, my brother, God rest his soul, he used to do the same thing. Kept it a secret for years until one day I caught him trying on my dress when he thought I wasn't home." She chuckled at the memory. "I was surprised, of course. But once the shock wore off, I realized it didn't change who he was. He was still my brother, still the same person I'd always loved." Mateo let out a shaky breath. "You're not disgusted?" "Oh, honey." Mrs. Rossi's eyes crinkled with warmth. "There's nothing disgusting about being true to yourself. It takes courage to embrace who you really are." The knot of tension in Mateo's chest began to loosen. He'd carried this secret for so long, terrified of discovery. And now that it was out, he felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "I don't know what to do now," he admitted. "I've hidden this part of myself for so long. I'm not sure I know how to stop." Mrs. Rossi considered this for a moment. "Well, why don't we start small? How about you show me some of your makeup techniques? I could use a few pointers myself." She winked, gesturing to her own face with a self-deprecating laugh. Mateo couldn't help but smile. "Are you sure?" "You don't have to." "I'd love to," she interrupted firmly. "And then maybe we can enjoy some of that lasagna together. What do you say?" He nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude for this unexpected ally. "I'd like that." As Mateo began explaining the intricacies of contouring, he felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future where he didn't have to hide, where Adeline could exist in the light instead of being relegated to stolen moments behind locked doors. It wouldn't be easy. There were still so many obstacles to overcome, so many fears to face. But as he met Mrs. Rossie's encouraging gaze in the mirror, Matteo knew he'd taken the first step on a new path, and he wasn't alone. Over the next few weeks, Matteo found himself spending more and more time with Mrs. Rossi. Their impromptu makeup session had blossomed into a genuine friendship, one that provided Matteo with a safe space to explore his identity as Adeline. Mrs. Rossi proved to be an eager student, soaking up Matteo's makeup tips with enthusiasm. In return, she shared stories of her brother, painting a picture of a man who had struggled with his own identity, but ultimately found peace in self-acceptance. He used to say that putting on a dress felt like coming home, Mrs. Rossi recalled one afternoon as they sat in her cozy living room, like he was finally wearing his true skin. Matteo nodded, understanding the sentiment all too well. That's how I feel when I'm Adeline, like I'm finally whole. Mrs. Rossi reached out, squeezing his hand. Then maybe it's time to let Adeline out a little more often, not just behind closed doors. The suggestion sent a thrill of excitement and terror through Matteo. I don't know if I'm ready for that, he admitted. What if someone sees me? What if they react badly? There will always be people who don't understand, Mrs. Rossi said gently. But there will also be those who accept you for who you are. You can't live your life in fear of what others might think. Matteo knew she was right, but the prospect of stepping out as Adeline still seemed daunting. Maybe I could start small, he mused, like wearing just a little bit of makeup in public, something subtle. Mrs. Rossi beamed. That sounds like a wonderful idea. Baby steps, dear. Encouraged by her support, Matteo decided to take the plunge. The next morning, he carefully applied a touch of mascara and the faintest hint of lip gloss before heading to work. It wasn't much, but it made him feel more like Adeline, more like himself. As he walked down the street, Matteo braced himself for stares or comments, but no one seemed to notice anything different. He made it through his entire shift at the bookstore without a single remark about his appearance. The small victory bolstered his confidence. Over the following days, Matteo gradually increased the amount of makeup he wore in public. A touch of blush here, a swipe of eyeshadow there. Each time he ventured out, he felt a little braver, a little more comfortable in his own skin. Mrs. Rossi cheered him on every step of the way. You're glowing, dear, she told him one evening as they shared a cup of tea. It's wonderful to see you coming into your own. Matteo smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. I couldn't have done it without you, he said softly. Your support means everything. As the weeks passed, Matteo found himself longing to fully embrace his Adeline persona in public. The idea both thrilled and terrified him. He confided his desire to Mrs. Rossi, who listened with her usual patience and understanding. I think I want to go out as Adeline, he admitted. Not just makeup, but fully dressed. I'm scared. Mrs. Rossi considered this for a moment. What if we went together? We could make an evening of it. Dinner, maybe a show. Somewhere not too crowded, but public enough for you to get a feel for it. Matteo's heart raced at the suggestion. You do that for me? Of course, dear. That's what friends are for. And so plans were made. Matteo spent hours agonizing over the perfect outfit, finally settling on a modest, knee-length dress in a deep burgundy. Mrs. Rossi helped him style a wig, offering gentle suggestions as they worked to create a natural look. When the night of their outing arrived, Matteo's hands shook as he applied his makeup. He stared at his reflection, marveling at the transformation. Adeline looked back at him from the mirror, her eyes bright with a mix of fear and excitement. A soft knock at the door made him jump. Are you ready, dear? Mrs. Rossi called. Matteo took a deep breath, smoothing down his dress. As ready as I'll ever be, he replied. He opened the door and Mrs. Rossi's face lit up. Oh, Adeline, she breathed. You look absolutely beautiful. Tears pricked at Matteo's eyes, threatening to ruin his carefully applied mascara. Thank you, he whispered. Mrs. Rossi offered her arm. Shall we? As they stepped out into the hallway, Matteo felt a moment of panic. What if they ran into one of the other neighbors? What if someone recognized him? But Mrs. Rossi patted his hand reassuringly. Remember, dear, you have nothing to be ashamed of. You're simply being true to yourself. They made it to the car without incident, and as they drove to the restaurant, Matteo felt his nerves begin to settle. The world didn't stop turning. No one pointed or stared. It was just another evening, except this time he was finally showing his true self to the world. The restaurant was quiet and dimly lit, providing a sense of privacy that helped Matteo relax. As they were shown to their table, he noticed a few curious glances, but nothing overtly hostile. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that he had every right to be there. Their waiter approached, a young man with a friendly smile. "Good evening, ladies. Can I start you off with some drinks?" Ladies. The word sent a thrill through Matteo. He was being seen as Adeline, truly and completely. As the evening progressed, Matteo found himself relaxing more and more. He and Mrs. Rossi chatted and laughed just as they always did. The fact that he was dressed as Adeline faded into the background, becoming just another part of who he was. After dinner, they decided to take a walk through a nearby park. The night air was cool against Matteo's skin, and he reveled in the feeling of the breeze rustling his skirt. "How do you feel?" Mrs. Rossi asked as they strolled along the path. Matteo considered the question. "Free," he said finally. "I feel free." Mrs. Rossi squeezed his arm. "I'm so proud of you, dear. You've come so far." As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with a group of young people heading in the opposite direction. Matteo tensed, bracing himself for potential ridicule, or worse. But the group simply nodded politely as they passed. One young woman even smiled, complimenting Matteo's dress. The encounter left Matteo feeling lightheaded with relief and joy. He'd faced one of his biggest fears and come out the other side unscathed. As they made their way back to the car, Matteo felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. "Thank you," he said to Mrs. Rossi, "for everything, for accepting me, for encouraging me. I don't know where I'd be without you." Mrs. Rossi patted his cheek affectionately. "You had it in you all along, dear. I just helped you see it." That night marked a turning point for Matteo. He'd taken a huge step towards living authentically, and the world hadn't come crashing down around him. It gave him the courage to continue pushing his boundaries, to embrace Adeline more fully in his day-to-day life. Over the following months, Matteo began incorporating more feminine elements into his wardrobe, even when he wasn't fully dressed as Adeline. A flowy blouse here, a pair of earrings there. He experimented with different styles, finding a balance that felt true to both sides of himself. Mrs. Rossi remained a constant source of support, always ready with a kind word or a bit of advice. She helped Matteo navigate the complexities of coming out to his family and close friends, offering a shoulder to cry on when reactions weren't as positive as he'd hoped. There were challenging days, of course, times when a cruel comment or a disapproving look would send Matteo spiraling into self-doubt. But he'd come too far to give up now. With each obstacle he overcame, his resolve only grew stronger. As Matteo became more comfortable with his identity, he found himself wanting to reach out to others who might be struggling with similar issues. With Mrs. Rossi's encouragement, he started volunteering at a local support group for gender-diverse individuals. It was there that Matteo met Marco, a young man who reminded him so much of himself when he first started exploring his identity as Adeline. Marco was shy and scared, unsure of how to reconcile his desire to express his feminine side with societal expectations. Matteo took Marco under his wing, sharing his own experiences and offering the same kind of support that Mrs. Rossi had given him. Watching Marco's confidence grow over time filled Matteo with a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. One evening, as Matteo and Mrs. Rossi shared their usual cup of tea, she remarked on the change she'd seen in him. "You're flourishing, dear," she said warmly. "It's like watching a butterfly emerge from its cocoon." Matteo smiled, feeling a surge of affection for the woman who had become like a second mother to him. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You gave me the courage to be myself." Mrs. Rossi shook her head. You had that courage all along. I just helped you find it." As they sat there, sipping their tea and chatting about their days, Mateo marveled at how far he'd come. From a closeted crossdresser living in constant fear of discovery to someone who could move through the world as his authentic self. There were still challenges ahead, of course. The journey of self-discovery was never truly over, but Mateo no longer faced those challenges alone. He had Mrs. Rossi, he had the friends he'd made in the support group, and most importantly, he had the strength that came from embracing all aspects of himself. Adeline was no longer a secret to be hidden away. She was a vital part of who Mateo was, a source of joy and self-expression that he could now share with the world. As the sun set outside Mrs. Rossi's window, painting the sky in vibrant hues of pink and orange, Mateo felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. He was exactly where he was meant to be, living as his true self. And for the first time in his life, he was excited to see what the future held. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still hurdles to overcome. But with each passing day, Mateo grew more comfortable in his own skin, more confident in his identity as both Mateo and Adeline. He'd found a balance that felt right, a way to honor all aspects of himself without compromising who he was at his core. Mrs. Rossi continued to be a steadfast presence in his life, a beacon of unconditional love and acceptance. Her unwavering support had not only helped Mateo embrace his true self, but had also inspired him to become that same kind of support for others. Through his volunteer work at the support group, Mateo found a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. Helping others navigate their own journeys of self-discovery brought him a deep sense of fulfillment. He saw himself in so many of the people he met, remembering his own fears and insecurities, and it filled him with joy to be able to offer the guidance and understanding he'd once so desperately needed. As months turned into years, Mateo's confidence continued to grow. He no longer felt the need to compartmentalize his life, to keep Adeline hidden away. Instead, he learned to integrate both aspects of his identity, allowing them to coexist harmoniously. There were still moments of doubt, days when the weight of societal expectations felt overwhelming, but in those moments, Mateo would think back to that first night he'd stepped out as Adeline, remember the feeling of freedom that had washed over him, and find the strength to keep moving forward. His relationship with his family had improved over time, though it hadn't been an easy road. Some relatives struggled to understand, but Mateo's patience and Mrs. Rossi's gentle advocacy had slowly won them over. Seeing Mateo happy and thriving did more to change their minds than any argument could have. At work, Mateo had finally found the courage to be open about his identity. To his relief, most of his colleagues were supportive, and those who weren't at least kept their opinions to themselves. The bookstore where he worked even started carrying more diverse literature, a change Mateo had quietly championed. As he reflected on his journey, Mateo realized how much his life had changed since that fateful day when Mrs. Rossi had accidentally discovered his secret. What had once been his greatest fear, being discovered, had turned out to be the catalyst for the most profound and positive change in his life. One sunny afternoon, as Mateo and Mrs. Rossi sat in her garden, enjoying the warmth of the day, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You know, dear," she said, her eyes twinkling, "I've been thinking, my brother, the one I told you about, he always dreamed of opening a little boutique. A place where people like you and him could shop for clothes and makeup without fear of judgment. He never got the chance, but, well, I've been wondering if that might be something you'd be interested in pursuing." Mateo's eyes widened at the suggestion. The idea of creating a safe space for others like him, a place where they could explore their identities freely, filled him with excitement. "That sounds amazing," he breathed. "But I wouldn't even know where to start." Mrs. Rossi patted his hand. "That's where I come in, dear. I may be old, but I still know a thing or two about running a business. And I have some savings set aside. I can't think of a better way to use it than to help you make this dream a reality." Tears welled up in Mateo's eyes. "Mrs. Rossi, I don't know what to say. That's incredibly generous of you." She waved off his thanks with a smile, Consider it an investment in happiness, yours and others. What do you say? Shall we give it a try? Mateo nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. Yes, he said firmly, let's do it. Over the next several months, Mateo threw himself into planning the boutique. He researched suppliers, scouted locations, and reached out to his contacts in the community for input and support. Mrs. Rossi was there every step of the way, offering advice and encouragement. Finally, after what felt like endless preparations, the day arrived to open the doors of Adeline's closet to the public. Mateo stood before the mirror in the back room, adjusting his outfit, a stylish blouse and skirt combo that blended masculine and feminine elements. It felt right, a perfect representation of his journey and who he'd become. Mrs. Rossi appeared beside him, her eyes misty with pride. You look wonderful, dear. Are you ready? Mateo took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. I am, he said, surprised to find that it was true. He was ready, not just for this moment, but for whatever the future might hold. As they walked to the front of the store, Mateo caught sight of the small crowd gathered outside. Friends from the support group, colleagues from the bookstore, even a few family members, all there to show their support. With a trembling hand, Mateo unlocked the door and flipped the sign to open. As the first customers began to trickle in, their faces alight with wonder and gratitude, Mateo felt a profound sense of coming full circle. He thought back to that scared, closeted person he'd once been, so terrified of being discovered. How far he'd come since then, how much he'd grown. And it had all started with one moment of accidental vulnerability, one person's unexpected acceptance. As he greeted each customer, helping them find clothes that made them feel true to themselves, Mateo silently thanked that version of himself, the one who'd been brave enough to tell the truth when discovered, the one who'd taken those first tentative steps towards self-acceptance. Catching Mrs. Rossi's eye across the store, Mateo smiled. He was Mateo, he was Adeline, he was both and neither and everything in between. And for the first time in his life, he was completely, unequivocally at peace with who he was. The boutique buzzed with excitement as customers explored the carefully curated selection of clothing, accessories, and makeup. Mateo moved from person to person, offering advice and encouragement, his heart swelling with each smile, each sigh of relief as someone found an outfit that made them feel like their true self. As the day wore on, Mateo found himself sharing his own story with many of the customers. He spoke of his journey from fear to self-acceptance, of the importance of having supportive people in your life. With each retelling, he felt a little stronger, a little more certain of his place in the world. Mrs. Rossi watched from behind the counter, her eyes shining with pride. She'd seen Mateo transform from a scared young man hiding his true self to this confident, compassionate person who was now helping others on their own journeys of self-discovery. It filled her with a sense of joy and purpose she hadn't felt in years. As the last customer left, their arms full of carefully wrapped packages, Mateo turned the sign to closed and leaned against the door with a contented sigh. We did it, he said, his voice filled with wonder. Mrs. Rossi came over to him, wrapping him in a warm hug. You did it, dear. This is all you. Mateo shook his head. No, we did it. I couldn't have done any of this without you. You've been my rock through all of this. They spent the next hour tidying up the store, straightening racks, and restocking shelves. As they worked, Mateo's mind wandered to all the possibilities that lay ahead. He imagined hosting workshops, bringing in guest speakers, creating a true community hub for people exploring their gender identity. What are you thinking about? Mrs. Rossi asked, noticing the faraway look in his eyes. Mateo smiled. The future, he said simply, and all the people we might be able to help. Towards the end of the store's first successful month, Mateo found himself browsing online for potential new additions to their inventory. With a growing customer base and a steady influx of sales, he thought it was time to expand their selection. As he scrolled through various websites, an idea began to form in his mind. Thanks for watching. The rest won't be viewable on YouTube, so check out Patreon if you want more. I hope you have a wonderful day, my cutie.